Live in studio.
With a college degree, by the way.
Yes.
By the way, completely educated, prepared for life. So none of these questions will be too hard for you, Your Majesty.
Not at all.
About the health care bill.
Yeah.
Yesterday, the Senate voted on, and this is what surprised me, a straight party line vote.
Yes.
On repeal. Now, I'm sure Mitch McConnell, who I guess finally succeeded in talking Harry Reid into having a vote, which he said he was not going to do, had to be somewhat surprised that even guys like Joe Manchin and perhaps even Ben Nelson, who were very critical of the bill when it originally passed, were siding with their majority leader. Why do you suppose that was?
A couple of reasons. First of all, when Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell reached that agreement about not ending the filibuster and maintaining the Senate as it always has been, they also reached a gentleman agreement that they were not going to treat things the way they did the last Congress, where Republicans used their filibuster power on almost every measure that came before the body, and Reid used his extraordinary powers as majority leader to block all amendments, essentially turning the Senate into very much like the House. And both sides were at daggers drawn, at least procedurally. Well, that's ended. So Reid said, look, we'll go back to the way the Senate's supposed to be. Amendments are now going to be allowed. So the first bill up, this FAA authorization bill, McConnell said, open amendments, here we go, game on, healthcare. Now, for Democrats, they have, at least for the moment, staked out a position, well, look, we can't repeal it, we shouldn't repeal it, but let's fix it. You have the Manchin, Ben Nelson, Bill Nelson, Claire McCaskill, John Tester, all up in 2012, nominally centrist Democrats who say, look, I voted for it, I was there, I like more of it than I dislike, and let's focus on the parts that we dislike. And yesterday they voted like 81-14 or something to get rid of the 1099 form, which is going to be a much more protracted debate than anyone in Washington currently appreciates, because the House Republicans are going to demand that there be a pay-for that lost revenue, and they want that pay-for to come right out of the money needed to build the infrastructure for health care.
Let me ask
you. So Democrats are now comfortable saying, I don't want to repeal it, I want to fix it, let's concentrate on fixing it, let's not focus on repealing it.
Does this strategy of a death of 1,000 cuts work over time? I know that they've now got their kind of signature vote in both bodies, Senate and House. Okay, so they've acquitted their trust with their voters. But now people are going to be saying, all right, now it's going to get dismantled, right? You're going to take it apart. You're going to bleed it to death by not funding it. Is it, you know, you've covered this stuff for a long time. Does that work, or does it blow back finally against the people that are trying to do it?
Well, you say death by 1,000 cuts. I think Republicans would be happy this year if they achieved just one cut. I mean, it's not going to be easy to even inflict that first cut on health care. 1099 provides one opportunity because the president wants to get rid of it. The uproar against that form, which, for those in the audience who don't know, if you're a business of any kind and you have a private a contractor that you do any transaction costing more than $600, you have to file a separate tax form to represent that transaction every single time. And of course, small businesses have just become unglued over this, understandably. And so there's about $17 billion in revenue tied to that. Well, if the Republicans are successful pulling that revenue out of what you need to build the infrastructure for health care, that will be one cut. There are not that many other cuts right now. What they can do through the power of the purse is deny funds across the board for any future architecture, but they have to get the president to sign that. And that's not going to be easy. So I can see right now potentially one cut. I can't see that many other cuts that are guaranteed to occur.
But does the process help them politically, or ultimately does it help the president as a guy?
Look, this debate is going to go on until 2012 because Republicans will argue that the entire future of President Obama's approach to all domestic policy can be seen through the prism of health care. A much larger bureaucracy with much higher taxes and much more regulatory overreach. And if that's what you want for the future of this country for the next 4 years, then you better vote for it in 2012. If you want to stop it, then you've got to stop Obama and not re-elect him in 2012 so the Republican president can actually sign something to dismantle this. The Republicans will characterize this health care bill as Obama policy across the federal government writ large. And if you like it, vote for it. If you don't, stop it.
We're talking with Major Garrett, National Journal, here on 630 WMAL. What about the other, we've been talking about the little cuts, the little knives, the big hatchet that could be the Supreme Court decision. And do Republicans want that to happen this year? Do Democrats want to see that decision this year? Or are they all expecting it to come next year? And could that essentially just make all of this move?
last question first. It could significantly alter all of this policy and political terrain. Bill Nelson of Florida, sensing this, because the most recent federal district court decision came out of Florida, Jacksonville Court, it was a bit shopped around. Bill McCollum, the Attorney General, went to what he knew was a very conservative federal district court in Florida, and got what many people would regard as the most aggressive constitutional argument against the entire law. And he said yesterday, Bill Nelson, the Florida senator up for re-election next year, I want an expedited Supreme Court ruling on this, because he can see this train coming. And on K Street, I've talked to several people in the healthcare lobbying industry who believe this is on a bullet train to the Supreme Court, and it could be decided as early as mid-spring next year.
So no 11th Circuit Court appeal? Straight to the Supreme Court?
The sense is this is creating enough uncertainty and giving states at least plausible explanations to why they're not going down this road, because it's very important under the law, though not all of the aspects of it are in law, but if you're going to dramatically expand your Medicaid reimbursement and Medicaid coverage in your state, there's huge fiscal implications to that. Republican governors and Democratic governors are in no mood right now to expand Medicaid because it costs them a ton of money, and they're already cash-strapped.
I don't know if you know this because it's not necessarily your beats, but we've talked about this. Elena Kagan, member of the Supreme Court, obviously was Solicitor General when this bill essentially passed. Would she have to recuse herself? Is that a decision that she makes? Do we know the answer to that?
She might have to recuse herself if she was involved in any way, shape, or form in answering internal policy questions about the constitutionality of this law as it was being developed.
Wouldn't you presume the Solicitor General, the governor, the president's lawyer, would be involved in something like that?
Possibly, but most times the Solicitor General is focused on cases to be argued before the bench, not necessarily, it depends on the administration, dispensing legal advice as Solicitor General about laws yet to be written that are in the drafting stage. She may or she may not have. I simply don't know. But it's a question that would certainly arise.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it will come up.
Talking with Major Garrett, National Journal. Continue our conversation coming up. 6:44 on WMAL. Check in with Patrice Sikora at the news desk.
You too. Visit us at mymortgageprices.com today. We'll listen and we'll help.
6:49 on the Grandy Group. Brian Neiman, Fred Grandy, Major Garrett's in studio with us this morning.
Glad to welcome back our college-educated congressional correspondent
Absolutely.
of the National Journal.
That's right.
One of the things that I heard an interesting discussion with John Boehner over the weekend on one of the talk shows, saying, "Look, it would be a disaster to not re-up the debt ceiling." So what is that telling you in terms of leverage for real spending cuts? Because I thought up to that point, the Republicans were thinking seriously of at least, if not holding the debt ceiling hostage to spending cuts, at least keeping it, in a warm embrace until they made up their mind what they wanted.
Well, the debt ceiling is a real issue, and the first thing that the administration and House Republicans are going to debate is how real that issue is presently. If you go back and look at the history, as House Republicans have, and I've reacquainted myself with it, back in 1985 when there was a Republican Treasury Secretary, Jim Baker, and in 1995 when there was a Democratic Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, several months elapsed after that horrible date of default because the Treasury Secretary has a lot of enumerated and unenumerated powers to move around various assets within the Treasury to avoid that default moment. And so Republicans are already beginning to say, look, the Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, told us end of March. He has at least until June. This is not something that's going to ripen right now, and we're not going to allow you to badger us with this deadline in order to take away our leverage on spending cuts. So, with more time, Republicans are going to try to build up more votes in the House on how many different things they can cut. Now, next week, the House Appropriations Committee is going to bring to the floor the CR, the continuing resolution, which occurs on March 4th. The government runs out of money. It's got nothing to do with the debt ceiling. It's just our budget expires on March 4th. That's going to be $55 to $60 billion of cuts from this fiscal year. So that's $55 to $60 billion of discretionary cuts, non-defense, in what remains this fiscal year, only 7 months. That's not going to be easy. That'll be the largest domestic discretionary cut ever in 7 months.
Okay.
And so House Republicans are going to have to vote on that. The Senate going to go along with it? Probably not. And then, on that issue, even before we get to the debt ceiling, there's going to be a shakedown between the White House and House Republicans How much are you willing to cut to keep the government open?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but on a congressional budget resolution, you have to have the House and Senate on board. But does the president
No,
sign
not a budget resolution, it's the continuing resolution, which is separate.
Oh, right, the continuing resolution.
Right.
The president does have to.
Yes,
agree to it.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The budget resolution, he does not.
He does not. Okay,
The House
that-
and Senate just need to agree, but that's separate from this continuing resolution. The continuing resolution continues to fund the government, and that funding stops on March 4th. Remember, during the lame duck, Republicans said, we don't want an omnibus. Remember they had that $1.1 trillion omnibus?
Yeah.
It's full of earmarks, full of junk we don't want? We don't want it. So the president said, fine. We'll fund the government until March 4th at last year's funding totals, which is already a bit of a savings. And now Republicans are going to add $55 billion of cuts to that. 55 or 60 billion, maybe even more, depending on how aggressive these new freshmen are.
But are you saying that what the Republicans are essentially proposing or claiming is that there really is no timeline to raise the debt ceiling, that if
It
it
is
doesn't
not
happen in
as
March,
soon-
we're not going to default?
Right.
Yeah.
We're not going to default.
It's not the guillotine that
No.
we're led to believe.
No, we're not. And they will point to mechanisms used by Republican and Democratic Treasury secretaries to avoid that default. Robert Rubin, during the whole shutdown confrontation with the Newt Gingrich-led 104th Congress, kept it going for months, literally months. And the House Republicans tried to stop him, wrote legislation specifically to take all these flexibilities away. Of course, it went nowhere in the Senate because of Democratic filibusters. So Republicans know it. They can't stop these powers from being used. They're just going to say early, start using them. You can avoid default. It's not the huge crisis. And don't pretend it is. So that's going to be the next stage of this debate. We're going to have a debate about this deadline, but long before we get to a debate or what actually it's going to cost the president to get the debt ceiling raised.
All right, interesting stuff. Always good to see you, Major. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks,
Major
Garrett.
Garrett, National Journal here on the Grandy Group, 654 on WMAL.